Okay, so today we're going to really dive deep into something I think we all kind of crave and search for in our own ways.
Yeah,
Happiness.
happiness.
Right, and I think we can all agree that there are mountains of self-help books and articles and gurus out there,
Oh my gosh. Yes.
all promising us the secrets to happiness.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
But
Let's face it.
yeah.
A lot of that stuff, it's pretty cliche, right?
Yeah, a lot of it is pretty surface level, I
Right.
think.
Yeah. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is we're going to look at happiness through a totally different lens.
Okay.
And to do that, we're going to turn to a book that I think offers a really unique and kind of refreshing perspective on this whole topic of happiness.
I'm intrigued.
It's called The Art of Happiness, a handbook for living. And what makes this book so special is that it's actually a collaboration between
Oh, wow.
His Holiness, the Dalai Lama,
Okay.
and a Western psychiatrist named Dr. Howard C. Cutler.
That's a fascinating pairing.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't get two more seemingly different perspectives. Totally.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's this cross-cultural dialogue between these two incredibly wise and insightful individuals.
I love it. So
Uh-huh.
tell me more about this book. How did it even come to be?
Well, the book itself really started taking shape during the Dalai Lama's visit to Arizona back in 1993.
Okay.
But the story actually begins much earlier,
Oh,
over a decade before that,
okay.
when Dr. Cutler was in Dharamsala, India, doing research.
Interesting.
He was there on a research grant studying traditional Tibetan medicine. And during that time, he had the incredible opportunity to actually meet and speak with the Dalai Lama.
Wow. So he was already immersed in that world in a way.
Right.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So what was it about the Dalai Lama that really sparked Cutler's interest in this whole idea of happiness?
I think what really struck Dr. Cutler was the Dalai Lama's incredible sense of serenity and inner peace.
Yeah, I mean, you always hear about that kind of just radiating from him.
Right. And it wasn't just a superficial kind of happiness.
Yeah.
It was this deep and abiding sense of joy and contentment.
It's palpable.
Totally.
Yeah.
And so Cutler's big question was,
Yeah.
what are the specific beliefs and practices that underpin this kind of unwavering happiness?
Right, because it's one thing to observe it from the outside,
Yeah,
but he really wanted to understand the root of it.
totally.
Yeah.
And he was also really curious about whether these principles,
Yeah.
weren't just limited to Buddhist teachings, but could actually be applied by anyone.
That's a huge question, right?
Right.
Like, can we learn from this wisdom tradition and actually apply it to our modern lives,
Exactly.
regardless of our own background?
That's the big question.
I love that.
So as you can imagine, right from the get-go,
Yeah.
you've got this Buddhist monk and a Western psychiatrist
Right.
coming together to talk about happiness.
Yeah, what a collision of worldviews.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were some really interesting differences in how they approach this whole topic. The Dalai Lama naturally drew from his deep understanding of Buddhist philosophy.
Yeah.
And Dr. Cutler brought his Western scientific training and psychological perspective.
Of course.
And this really highlights how much our own,
Background.
background and beliefs
Mm.
can shape how we see the world.
Absolutely. Our lens shapes what we see.
I'm
It's like
on a-
we're looking through different colored glasses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this difference in worldview was really apparent in their early conversations.
Give me an example.
Well, for instance, they had some pretty lively discussions about the nature of thoughts and feelings.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big one.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, is it all just brain chemistry or is there something more to it?
Right, because from a purely materialist perspective, it's all just neurons firing.
Right.
But there's this whole other realm of experience that doesn't fully capture.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then they also talked about the role of the unconscious mind,
Oh, that's fascinating.
which is something that's, very much a part of Western psychology,
Huge in Western psychology, yeah.
but maybe not so much in Buddhist thought.
Right.
And then even the concept of past lives.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a big one.
That was a major point of divergence.
For sure, a fundamental difference in their starting point.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes you really think about,
Yeah,
your own assumptions.
absolutely.
Like, how much do our pre-existing beliefs, kind of color our experience of the world and our own inner lives?
It's like we're walking around with these filters on
Right.
that shape how we perceive everything.
Yeah. And, speaking of filters, the Dalai Lama actually used a really interesting analogy to illustrate this point.
Oh, I love a good analogy.
He compared holding on to these fixed perspectives
Okay.
to searching for a lost object in the wrong room.
Okay.
So you can search as hard as you like.
Right.
But if you're not looking in the right place with an open mind, you're never going to find what you're looking for.
So true. We can get so stuck in our own ways of seeing things.
Totally. And I think that's a really powerful image for us to keep in mind as we, kind of delve deeper into this whole exploration of happiness.
Especially with something as complex and nuanced as happiness.
Right, because it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Not at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So having kind of set the stage, with their different perspectives,
Okay.
they then start to really grapple with this fundamental question of what is the purpose of life?
Okay, so the big existential question, right?
Exactly.
The meaning of life.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they both agree that, there's this inherent human longing for happiness.
Of course we all want to be happy.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's actually really comforting to realize that this isn't just some, modern Western idea.
Yeah.
They point out that thinkers from all different cultures and throughout history,
Oh, yeah. Like,
from Aristotle
okay.
to William James,
Right.
have all recognized this
Desire.
desire for happiness as like a central aim of life.
So it's really a universal human thing
Yeah.
that's reassuring in a way.
Right. Like it's not just us.
Yeah, exactly. We're not alone in wanting to be happy.
Right.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting because
Okay.
they challenge this common assumption that seeking happiness is somehow selfish.
Oh, that's interesting because you do hear that a lot.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you're just being selfish if you're always focused on your own happiness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But their discussions, and this is actually backed up by some really fascinating psychological experiments, suggest that the opposite is actually true.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, they found that happy people tend to be more sociable and more open to new experiences, and importantly, more helpful and forgiving towards others.
Wow. So it's not this inward turning thing.
Right.
It actually makes you more outward focused.
Exactly.
That's really counterintuitive.
Right. And there were these really interesting studies that they cited where, they had people who, like found a small amount of money unexpectedly or had just watched something funny.
Okay.
They were more likely to then help a stranger in need.
Wow. So just a little boost in mood
Yeah.
makes you more likely to be kind.
Right.
That's great.
And, thinking about it from our own experience,
Yeah.
don't you find that when you're feeling good, you're just naturally more patient and generous with people?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I'm in a good mood, I'm much more likely to help someone out or let something slide that might normally bug me.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So if seeking happiness actually makes us better people,
Right.
then what does that say about the bigger picture?
Well, it means that striving for happiness isn't just some,
Selfish indulgence.
selfish indulgence.
Right.
It actually has this positive ripple effect,
Yeah.
strengthens our relationships, it enriches our communities, and it ultimately contributes to a more positive society.
It becomes almost a responsibility then.
Right.
Yeah, to cultivate happiness for the greater good. That's a powerful shift in perspective.
Totally. So, okay, we've established that,
Right.
this desire for happiness is fundamental to being human.
Right. It's kind of wired into it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next big question is,
Okay.
where does this happiness actually come from?
Right. The $1 million question.
Exactly. And this is where their discussion gets really interesting
I'm all ears.
because they dive into this whole debate about external versus internal sources of happiness.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic debate, nature versus nurture.
Right.
Is it what we have or who we are?
Exactly.
Okay. And,
What's their take on this?
well, they actually share some really personal stories.
Well, I love personal stories.
that really highlight the primary role of our minds in shaping our happiness.
Okay, so it's more about the internal then.
Well, they make a really compelling case for it.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, for instance, they talk about, this friend who came into a lot of money quite suddenly.
Oh, yeah. Like won the lottery or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Didn't actually become any happier as a result.
Really?
Yeah.
You'd think that would be the key to happiness, right?
Right.
All your money problems solved.
But it wasn't.
That's so interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they contrast that story with another friend who was facing a very serious illness.
Oh, wow.
But despite those really challenging circumstances,
Yeah.
found a much deeper appreciation for life and actually experienced greater happiness.
That's really powerful.
Right.
Yeah. It really challenges our assumptions about what brings happiness.
Totally. And I think these stories really speak to,
This I need.
this idea that happiness is not just about what happens to us.
Yeah.
It's about how we interpret and respond to those events.
So it's an inside job.
Right.
Yeah.
And they delve into this concept of adaptation, which I think is really important for us to understand.
What's that?
Well, it's this idea that we tend to adjust to our external circumstances,
Okay.
both the positive and the negative. And we eventually kind of return to this relatively stable baseline level of happiness.
So, like, even if something amazing happens to us,
Right.
we kind of get used to it and go back to our normal level of happiness?
Exactly.
That's kind of depressing.
Well, it can be,
Yeah.
but it also means that,
Yeah.
if something really bad happens to us,
Right.
we can also adapt and eventually find a way to cope and move forward.
Okay. That's a more positive spin on it.
Right.
Yeah.
And they give some interesting examples like lottery winners,
Yo.
who you would think would be like the happiest people on earth.
Right. They have it all.
But sometimes they actually end up less happy in the long run.
Really? Yeah. Why is that?
Well, it's a complex issue, but, sometimes that sudden wealth can actually lead to isolation and a loss of purpose and all sorts of other problems.
It can really upend your life.
Totally.
Yeah.
And then they also talk about people who've faced,
Yeah.
incredible hardship, but still managed to find moments of joy and meaning in their lives.
So it's not all about external circumstances.
Right.
It's about our inner resilience.
Exactly. And I think that's a really empowering message.
It is, because it means that even in the face of really tough situations,
Yeah.
we still have some agency over our own happiness.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, they do acknowledge the role of genetics in all of this.
Okay, yeah, because our genes do play a part in everything.
Right.
Yeah.
But they emphasize that even though our genes might predispose us to a certain range of happiness,
Okay.
we still have a significant amount of control over our own well-being.
So it's not predetermined.
No,
We have the
not-
power to shape our own happiness.
Right. And they call this the mind factor.
The mind factor. I like that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's this idea that, we can actively work with our state of mind to cultivate greater happiness.
So it's not passive.
Not at all.
It's something we have to actively work towards.
Exactly. And they do acknowledge the more conventional sources of happiness that we often hear about.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, like what kind of things?
like good physical health,
Okay.
having enough material possessions,
Sure.
strong friendships and relationships.
Makes sense. Those are all important.
Right.
Yeah.
But the key point here
Yeah.
is that our mental state is the key to actually experiencing the benefits of these things.
So it's not just about having them.
Right.
It's about how we relate to them.
Exactly. Like you can have all the wealth in the world,
Right.
but if your mind is constantly plagued by negativity
Yeah.
and worry,
Yeah.
that wealth is not going to bring you lasting happiness.
It's like having a feast in front of you,
Yeah.
but you have no appetite.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they make a really interesting distinction
Okay.
between material wealth and inner warmth.
Inner warmth.
Yeah.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, imagine,
Yeah.
two people.
Okay.
They both have similar levels of material wealth. But one person is emotionally isolated and maybe even bitter,
Okay.
and the other person has a lot of warmth and kindness and compassion.
Okay, so it's about their inner qualities.
Right.
Yeah.
And they argue that the person with inner warmth has a much deeper and more resilient source of happiness.
It makes sense because that inner warmth is something that can't be taken away easily.
Exactly.
While material wealth can fluctuate.
Totally.
Right.
And they even take it a step further
Okay.
by looking at the difference between pleasure and happiness.
Oh, interesting, because those are often used interchangeably.
Right, but they make a really important distinction.
Okay.
So they share this story about a woman who chose to stay in Phoenix, Arizona,
Okay.
despite absolutely hating the intense heat.
Oh, wow. So it must have been really important to her.
Right,
Yeah.
because her work with children there brought her this profound sense of satisfaction and meaning.
So she prioritized happiness over pleasure.
Exactly.
That's a good distinction.
Right. And it really speaks to this idea that,
Yeah.
true happiness often comes from something deeper than just,
Fleeting pleasure.
fleeting pleasures.
Right, like that good feeling you get from a delicious meal.
Right.
Or a fun night out.
Yeah,
Those are great, but they don't necessarily lead to lasting happiness.
totally. And if we look at this,
Yeah.
through a wider lens,
Okay.
like from ancient philosophers like Epicurus,
Okay.
who believed that pleasure was the ultimate good.
Right, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain.
Right.
Yeah.
To more modern thinkers like Freud,
Okay.
who, talked about our instinctual drives.
Right.
I think their discussion really highlights that while pleasure is definitely a part of a good life,
Yeah, of course.
it's not the whole story.
Right.
True happiness often springs from something much deeper.
Yeah, a sense of purpose and meaning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, okay,
Yeah.
we've talked about the importance of our mental state for happiness.
Right. Our mindset is key.
Yeah. So the next question is,
Okay.
how do we actually train our minds for happiness?
Right. Because if it's a skill,
Yeah.
we need to learn how to develop it.
Exactly. And
Okay.
they start by emphasizing that,
Yeah.
once our basic needs are met,
Right. The essentials.
yeah, like food and shelter and safety,
Okay.
our mind becomes the primary tool for achieving happiness.
So it's not about endlessly chasing external things.
Right.
It's about cultivating our inner world.
Exactly.
That's empowering.
Right.
Yeah.
And they compare it to learning any new skill,
Okay.
like playing an instrument or learning a language.
Right. It takes practice
Exactly.
and dedication.
Right.
Okay.
And to kind of illustrate this, they talk about the concept of neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
That sounds complicated.
It's actually a really cool idea.
Okay. Break it down for me.
Well, it's basically the brain's ability to change and grow new neural connections throughout our lives.
So our brains aren't fixed.
Not at all.
They're constantly adapting.
Right. And they give this great example of,
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
finger tapping exercise where if you repeatedly practice a specific finger tapping pattern,
Yeah.
it actually changes the structure of your brain.
Wow. So our actions can literally reshape our brains.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Right.
Yeah, it gives you hope that we can change.
Totally. And this is really the scientific basis
Yeah.
for this whole idea that we can train our minds.
So it's not just some fluffy self-help concept.
Not at all.
It's rooted in actual neuroscience.
Exactly.
I love that.
And they introduce these terms,
Okay.
wholesome behaviors
Okay.
and unwholesome behaviors.
Wholesome and unwholesome.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, they define them pretty simply.
Yeah.
Wholesome behaviors are those that lead to happiness and well-being
Okay.
for ourselves and others.
That makes sense.
And unwholesome behaviors are those that lead to suffering.
Right. For ourselves and others.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so this naturally leads to a pretty big question.
Which is-
if we all inherently want to be happy and avoid suffering.
Right. That's kind of a given.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do we need to actually learn and train ourselves to do these things?
That's a good question. Like, shouldn't it just be instinctual?
Right. Like if you touch a hot stove,
Yeah.
you immediately know that it's going to cause pain.
You learn that lesson pretty quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
So why isn't it the same with negative emotions like anger?
Right. Which obviously causes suffering.
Right.
Yeah. That's
Yep.
a good point.
And to answer this, they use a really helpful analogy
Oh, I love analogies.
of fire.
Fire. Okay.
So with fire,
yeah.
the negative consequences are immediate and tangible.
Right. You get burned.
Right.
Yeah.
But with emotions like anger,
Okay.
the effects can be more delayed
Yeah.
or less obvious in the moment.
Right. It's not always a clear cause and effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's where this concept of dharma comes in,
Dharma.
which,
Yeah.
in this context refers to the principles and practices that help us navigate life
Oh.
in a way that minimizes suffering and maximizes well-being.
So like a guidebook for living a good life.
Yeah.
Okay.
And they emphasize that this often requires conscious effort and learning to understand the long-term consequences of our actions.
It's like we need to develop that long-term vision
Right.
instead of just focusing on the immediate gratification.
Exactly. And it's like understanding the long-term health consequences of,
Yeah.
unhealthy eating habits.
Right.
Versus the immediate pleasure of eating a whole bag of chips.
Oh, I can relate to that.
Right.
Yeah, we need that delayed gratification muscle.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay, so we've talked about training our mouths for happiness,
right.
but is there something inherent in us
Yeah.
that is already geared towards happiness?
That's a great question. And they actually propose a really optimistic view of human nature.
Okay, I like optimistic.
They argue that our fundamental nature isn't one of aggression or selfishness,
Okay, that's a relief.
but rather a foundation of gentleness and a deep potential for compassion.
So we're not inherently bad.
Right.
We have this capacity for good within us.
Exactly. And they give some really compelling evidence for this.
Oh, I'm all ears.
So they start by looking at our very earliest experiences as infants.
Okay, so like babies.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how we're completely dependent on care and affection from the very beginning.
Right, we literally can't survive without it.
Right.
Yeah.
And they point to the very first act of nursing
Okay.
as this,
Primal.
primal example of our need for connection.
Yeah, that bond between mother and child.
Exactly.
It's so fundamental.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's really fascinating
Okay.
is that our physical structure actually seems to be aligned with these compassionate states.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so when we're calm and feeling affectionate,
Yeah.
it actually has beneficial effects on our physical health.
Wow. So kindness is good for our bodies too.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they bring in the absolutely crucial role of social connection.
Okay. Yeah. We're social creatures. Yeah. And they actually cite a bunch of studies,
Okay.
like the Alameda County study,
The Alameda County study.
which followed thousands of people over decades.
Wow, that's a long-term study.
Right.
Yeah.
And it found that a lack of close relationships
Yeah.
is linked to poorer health outcomes,
Okay.
greater unhappiness,
Yeah.
and increased levels of stress.
So loneliness is literally bad for us.
Exactly.
Wow, we need those connections.
We do.
Yeah.
And to kind of capture this idea of our innate capacity for compassion,
Mm-hmm.
they use this beautiful analogy of a seed,
A seed, okay.
the seed of compassion
The seed of compassion.
that's within each of us.
Okay.
And they compare it to the way we learn language.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, just like we have this innate capacity for language that
Good.
flourishes and grows with the right environmental input,
Yeah.
so too does our capacity for compassion.
So it needs to be nurtured.
Right.
Okay,
And they
fine.
point to things like,
How our parents regulated their own emotions.
okay, yeah, that makes sense.
The examples of caring behavior that we witnessed growing up.
Right, so the environment we grow up in
Exactly.
shapes our capacity for compassion.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they really challenge us to reconsider this,
Yeah.
common assumption that human beings are inherently selfish.
Right, because we often think of people as being out for themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they suggest that actually we have this incredible potential for genuine helpfulness.
So it's more about cooperation than competition.
Right. And they even point to the behavior of infants.
Oh, babies.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how they're almost instinctively programmed to bring pleasure to their caregivers.
Really?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have thought of that.
And they talk about how their senses are geared towards connection
Okay.
and how a baby's smile
Yeah.
can trigger such a strong caregiving response in adults.
That's right. It just melts your heart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if we start to believe that, other people are fundamentally compassionate,
Okay.
it can really change how we interact with the world.
It creates a more positive and trusting environment.
Right.
Yeah.
It reduces our fear and it fosters greater openness and connection.
It's a win-win.
Exactly.
Oh,
And so this naturally leads into their discussion about the importance of human warmth.
Human warmth.
Yeah.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And they argue that this human warmth and compassion is absolutely essential for genuine happiness.
So it's not just a nice to have.
Right.
It's fundamental.
Totally. And they give this great example of
Okay.
the Dalai Lama's interaction with a hotel housekeeper.
Okay, a hotel housekeeper.
Yeah.
You're right.
And, he's this world-renowned spiritual leader,
Right.
but he treated this housekeeper with the same warmth and respect.
Wow. So he really walks the walk.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that really speaks to his genuine compassion.
It's not just about grand gestures.
Yeah.
It's about those everyday interactions.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
And they emphasize the importance of really understanding the usefulness of compassion in our own lives.
Okay, so it's not just some abstract ideal.
Right.
It has practical benefits.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm listening.
So when we truly grasp the value of compassion,
Yeah.
it actually creates a desire within us to cultivate it more.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
So understanding its benefits makes us want to be more compassionate.
Exactly.
That's cool.
And they explain how approaching others with compassion
Okay.
actually reduces our own fear.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, it creates this more positive and open atmosphere in our interactions.
Okay.
And it increases the likelihood that we'll receive warmth and affection in return.
So it's like a positive feedback loop?
Exactly.
You put out kindness and you get kindness back.
Right.
Okay.
And they really encourage us to take the initiative
Okay.
to offer compassion rather than just waiting for it to come our way.
Be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. And to kind of illustrate this interconnectedness, they have this
Yeah.
really thought-provoking exercise
Okay.
where they ask you to think about the shirt you're
For
wearing.
sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to trace back all the people and processes that were involved in its creation.
Okay, so like the cotton farmers.
Yeah.
The factory workers.
Right. The people who shipped it to the store.
The salespeople.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you really think about all of that,
Yeah.
it gives you this incredible sense of interconnectedness with all these people.
And humbling.
Right.
Yeah. It really makes you realize that we're all part of this intricate web.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it really challenges this sense of you know,
separation.
separation and isolation.
Yeah, that we often feel.
Right.
Yeah.
And then they expand on